wonderful to be here, and I'm sure you'll be disappointed to hear my voice after the wonderful accent. So, it really is great to be here. I think for most of the time that I've sort of been working around media, started as a paper reporter, but after that I've been a journalist, started a long time ago, and worked for local radio and then television, and ultimately at some point in time NBC in Cleveland and then CNN in Washington, produced programs that have been seen around the globe. I'm happy I'm not doing that. And what I didn't quite understand, and one of the core things that I'd like to communicate, was that I was given those opportunities to be involved and engaged in media as a journalist because there were dramatic rule changes made essentially by folks struggling in what was then thought of as the Negro movement in the South, later thought of as the Civil Rights movement. But those movements created a door and an opening so that television stations and radio stations began to look for people like me. So people who, again, like me, who were really interested in media as a means of social change, who thought of media as a way to sort of change what they saw, or what we saw as inequities and inequalities in America. Growing up watching television in the Detroit market, I didn't see people who looked like me unless they were in handcuffs, and they certainly weren't anchors on television stations or things like that. And the reporting about what was going on in our communities was really sort of awful and distorted. To some extent that's changed, but only to some extent. The riots in '68 created even greater pressures to change things in the media. And there seemed actually to be an opening. And so part of what we saw was a very slow trickle number of both women, because there weren't women on the air either, and minorities, at least in the Detroit market, were finally getting on the air. And it seemed like just a wonderful time to be able to be engaged. And people were recruited. And I would get in a program like this and say something, and the news director would come up to me and say, "We really need you to come and work for our radio station or television station." It was strange days. I don't really see that now. But those opportunities were created by social movements. They weren't created by smart legislators. They weren't created by regulators who really cared. They weren't created because people were marching in the streets. They were created because there were social movements that were really sort of complex, involving both legal work, confronting the FCC, confronting the FCC in court, people who were protesting and complaining about what was happening in media in different markets around the country, riots that were somehow connected, but weren't connected at all, as the Kerner Commission determined. And so opportunities were created. By the time I was at CNN, almost all of that regime that had been looking for me to do things like ascertainments, to go into local communities to find out what they were interested in, the license challenges that we put in place, almost all that was gone by '84. About maybe 15 years at most, maybe 15 years, that there was really sort of an effective regime that really allowed communities to hold local radio stations and television stations accountable. It has been gone now for, over 20, and folks barely remember that it was even in place. Amazing social change. So we see social change on one end, where we see essentially movement putting those rules in place, because believe me, they were really not in place before 1967 or 68. And then another movement that destroyed those rules around the mid-1980s. It was a very purposeful movement because folks who were conservatives, both in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, had decided that a lot of pointy-headed liberals had really sort of gone too far, and that they really could no longer, frankly, trust what was happening on ABC or CBS or ABC or the other stations, or what was happening in local markets. And so they began to do things like eliminating ascertainment rules. They began to extend license terms for stations. Very clear, very purposeful. And in addition to changing the rules, very deliberately changing the rules under the Reagan administration, they also did something else. They began buying up stations. Very early on. I mean, the first sort of note about this, really, for me at least, when I was at CNN, was what happened with CBS, which was, for many of us, just an extraordinary network of bureaus all around the world. And I spent time, I produced kind of Bernie Shaw's program when he was at CNN, and Bernie was, for some period of time, actually, the bureau chief in Buenos Aires. They closed that bureau down. They closed bureaus down all around the world, CBS did. And at the time I was at CNN, we had more bureaus than CBS or almost any other place in the country, except for BBC Radio. And that was Lawrence Tisch, hotel magnate, also owned, I think, Lorillard Tobacco, and immediately began to sort of eliminate jobs and eliminate correspondents who had been there for years. One of my heroes, after studying the civil rights movement and the media coverage of that movement, was a guy named Nelson Benton, who was a white reporter in the South, very brave man who was beaten several times by covering the civil rights movement in the South. White reporters who covered that movement were often the first target because they were viewed as traitors. And so Nelson came into CNN looking for a job, and I saw this, small, white, gray-haired man, and thought I recognized him. And while I was at CNN, he was looking for a job on my show, and I said, what are you doing? He said, well, they really just sort of fired us at CBS. And I said, well, what's going on? He said, well, Tisch took over, and all these rules have changed, and there's now this media consolidation, which is like, if you saw what was happening today, you'd be amazed. And I knew nothing about this. I was covering Washington every day. I'd been in almost every important place you could think of in Washington, but not the FCC. And so I began to read stuff at the FCC, and I was just amazed that the television was now being compared to a toaster, and other things. It was crazy. What was happening? And I tried to get the story on CNN and could not. Not enough visuals, kind of complicated, kind of boring, and so that really sort of led me to sort of think about what it was that I was doing, and to get out and go to law school, and to figure out how I can work on essentially changing the rules, the structures